Good evening. Today we'll be continuing our ongoing coverage of the Kong Begun substance abuse scandal that's rocking our nation. It's recently become known that America's teenagers have been abusing the popular ape deterrent spray Kong Begun for a cheap and apparently horrific buzz known as cranky Konging. This follows the revelation that the product contains the controversial new age hallucinogen Yoko interspersed kerosene essentially oily sodium, or yikes as it's since been coined. The media has since labeled this controversy Kongbigate, not to be mistaken with Kongbi Corp's other product, Kongbigate, a fencing system for renegade gorillas that is apparently doing gangbusters now as parents scramble to contain their intoxicated kids. As the FDA investigates whose bright idea it was to pump yikes into a spray for angry gorillas, they've urged consumers to stop using Kongbigun due to the obvious, but still legally just alleged safety hazards related to it. Coming up next, our correspondent, Michael Belowski, takes you to the scene of a thwarted burglary in Brooklyn, New York. The culprits? Two brothers completely out of their gourd on Kongbigun. Their point of entry? Your plumbing. Released in 1995 for the Nintendo Game Boy, Donkey Kong Land is a 2D platformer that serves as the first follow-up to the Super Nintendo's Donkey Kong Country. Developed by Rare, the game does the seemingly Herculean task of recreating the visuals and gameplay found in its SNES counterpart on Nintendo's significantly weaker 8-bit hardware. Donkey Kong Land follows DK and Diddy, but not that Diddy, on an adventure to rescue their banana horde from King K. Rool, who's stolen it following an argument with Cranky Kong as to whether or not Donkey Kong Country was a good game or something kids enjoyed due to its fancy graphics. That's really the plot, by the way. Like, it's in the manual and everything. In a lot of ways, the game's extremely self-aware plot more or less says everything that needs to be said about it. Fresh off the success of the original Donkey Kong Country and how it was essentially designed around shutting down claims that the SNES was becoming outdated, it's kinda hard not to imagine that Nintendo basically just told Rare to do the same thing on the Game Boy for the same exact reason. You know, or else. Upon its release, Donkey Kong Land received some fairly positive reviews from critics, who more or less agreed that it was an extremely ambitious game for Nintendo's 8-bit hardware. The game would go on to receive 2 direct sequels on the Game Boy, along with a number of other sequels in the form of other Donkey Kong Country games. While I didn't exactly grow up with the Donkey Kong Country games, outside of having Donkey Kong 64 and a copy of DK Land 2 on a bootleg multi-cart I had, I do love the series and have a ton of respect for the character. In fact, in the days leading up to and during the duration of the pandemic so far, I actually found myself getting really into the series. I distinctly remember doing everything from listening to the game's soundtracks on the way to work every morning, streaming my first playthrough of them to my friends before we'd record our old movie podcast at night, and I also remember devouring anything I could that pertained to the development of the games too. As far as I'm concerned, the original Donkey Kong Country trilogy stands as one of the best platforming trilogies of all time, which makes Nintendo's and Rare's totally mutual decision to more or less recreate the game on the Game Boy a bit of a no-brainer. But does it hold up? Because while the idea of putting your hit new work of technical mastery on a handheld certainly sounds like a good idea, it also kinda sounds like a recipe for disaster too. And while Donkey Kong Land was certainly well received back in the day, I'm relatively curious as to whether or not the first Donkey Kong Land can really justify its existence as a pseudo-demake when I can just play Donkey Kong Country on the go now. And that's by no means a knock on this game or anything too. I just think it's a valid question to ask when this sub-series was literally conceived to give us Donkey Kong Country's action on the go. And I think this question is especially relevant to ask these days because Nintendo would go on to release actual ports of Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance. Plus, you can just straight up emulate the Donkey Kong Country trilogy on stuff like Nintendo Switch Online now too. Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What's a portable version of a console game or series that you really enjoyed playing? Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. On top of that, you can check out my answer to the question of the day via the pinned comment, and if you're new here and are enjoying what you see so far, feel free to subscribe or whatever so that you can check out all the other stuff I come up with in the future. And with that out of the way, on with the video. While I think it'd be noble to simply review Donkey Kong Land on its own merits, I feel as though doing so would probably fail to adequately cover and discuss things. So, in order to review this game, I'm actually going to compare it to Donkey Kong Country quite a bit, due to its status as a pseudo-conversion of that title. And while this feels a bit unfair due to the fact that DKC runs on significantly more powerful hardware, I feel as though it needs to be done in order to properly contextualize Donkey Kong Land and where many of its faults lay. However, I'd just like to state from now that this doesn't necessarily mean that I dislike the game or that I'm gonna try and take easy shots at it for being what it is. I just feel like the game openly invites these comparisons by design though. I mean, it's the literal plot of the game after all. Donkey Kong Land takes place across 4 different worlds that can be navigated via a world map similar to the one in Donkey Kong Country. As an adaptation of Donkey Kong Country, the game similarly revolves around navigating DK and Diddy to the end of the stage in order to move on to the next one. And just like in DKC, this leads to carefully needing to navigate tricky platforming challenges, going head-to-head with Kremlings, and collecting bananas along the way to score extra lives, which are nearly impossible not to hoard.
I'll be a living God!
At first glance, it's Donkey Kong Country through and through, with the game even going as far as to use the same exact assets as the ones used in the Super Nintendo original. And while that's basically true, or was at least the idea behind the game itself, it wasn't long before I started to notice some of the cracks starting to show for the game. You see, while Donkey Kong Country is just a 2D platformer, it also happens to have been one of the most technically advanced ones to ever make it to the Super Nintendo. And I'm not even talking about the visuals here, though I'll get to them eventually. I mean that the actual gameplay itself had a decent amount going on under the hood that unfortunately the Game Boy counterpart just kinda lacks. Among the many things that really helped the original DKC stand out from its contemporaries was the way that the game itself felt. While nowhere near as fast-paced as something like Sonic the Hedgehog, Donkey Kong Country still has a certain momentum and inertia to its gameplay that feels extremely unique. And Donkey Kong Land, on the other hand, doesn't quite play as fast or smoothly as you'd probably want it to. There's nothing inherently wrong with the way the game plays, I guess, but it often just ends up feeling more like an approximation of the real thing as opposed to a straight-up facsimile. Still, the fact that the game runs at all is really impressive, especially given how well it runs for a title on the original Game Boy specifically. You can basically do everything you'd want to do in a Donkey Kong Country game here, from rolling, jumping, and switching between Donkey Kong and Diddy respectively. It's just that each of these things feel a bit compromised. Even something as minute as the way you switch between characters feels a bit off in the game. Whereas you can always tell you have an extra hit point on the Super Nintendo version by whether or not you have another character next to you on screen, Donkey Kong Land has them pop in and out of existence to switch places with you whenever you hit the select button or get hit. And while this doesn't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things, it's still kinda weird. I mean, collecting an extra hit from a DK barrel in this game makes their rescue almost look like an act of rapture thanks to how they get whisked into the sky. It seriously looks like a scene straight out of that movie This Is the End. Which happens to be a pretty decent Seth Rogen movie and actually makes casting him as Donkey Kong make the tiniest bit of sense, oh my god. However, some of these compromises are a pretty hard pill to swallow. While using your roll to kill enemies usually feels pretty awesome in the Donkey Kong Country series, it kinda feels a little pitiful and clumsy in this game by comparison. Popping into a roll near a Kremling will get the job done, sure, but something about the distance traveled in that roll and how it trips up your momentum doesn't feel right and usually leaves me unsure as to whether or not I'll actually hit my enemy to begin with. And because of that, I noticed that I started to avoid using the roll whenever I was dealing with an enemy because it just didn't feel like a reliable enough way to deal with them. And while jumping on enemies certainly feels better than rolling into them like a bowling ball, I still feel like it leaves a bit to be desired. Something about going from a run to a jump just feels stiff, and it kinda makes it hard to judge how far you'll get off of one of your jumps. It's perfectly functional, but it just doesn't feel right, like cooking naked. Or watching Netflix at your day job. Naked. Despite these issues though, Donkey Kong Land isn't all doom and gloom. Earlier in the video, I said that I considered the game a pseudo-demake of Donkey Kong Country made for handhelds, and I largely believe that to be accurate. This is because the game apparently runs on the same engine that was used on DKC, only cut back and, Game Boy-ified. And while the game does use a lot of the same assets from the SNES game as a jumping off point, it's exactly that, a jumping off point.
Idiot.
The game actually features a ton of new level designs and layouts that are actually pretty well thought out and designed. And honestly, I don't think that's a bad thing. If anything, the decision to make this game more of an adaptation or remix of the original as opposed to a clear-cut conversion of it probably helps justify this game's existence in the modern era, and it also helps a great deal with optimizing the game for the hardware. While I wouldn't call these levels revelatory by any stretch of the word, they mostly work well on the Game Boy's limited screen space and minimize the usual portable platforming issue of screen crunch by featuring layouts that remove most of the risks associated with it. There's definitely still a helpful smattering of screen crunch and poor enemy placement because of it on display here, but it generally shows a level of care from Rare that I really appreciate. And yet, some of these levels are also just rough. For example, the last world in the game features these tiny platforms that could be a total pain to jump onto, and also has these straight up awful cloud levels that really tested my patience. I know the minecart levels in the DKC series usually get some grief from fans of the franchise, but pound for pound, I actually think these levels are way worse. Again though, I am ultimately glad that Rare decided to give this game new levels as opposed to just rehashing the original. While they could have just tossed the original Donkey Kong Country on a Game Boy cart with some shorter levels and modified content, this really does feel like an expansion pack to the original more than anything. And like, they did eventually port Donkey Kong Country to the Game Boy Color too, so that is also a thing if you want it. While none of these levels really stood out as being particularly noteworthy, and despite the fact that the gameplay itself leaves a bit to be desired for me, Donkey Kong Land is still a pretty fun game. It's just a shame that it's on the Game Boy. Don't get me wrong, I love the original Game Boy, but it was honestly just barely up to the task of getting this game running on it. Even though the original Donkey Kong Country may look relatively simple by today's standards, there is no denying that trying to recreate those visuals on the go was a tall order back in 1995. And while it's really impressive that this game uses the same assets as the one found in the Super Nintendo game, is it really worth it? There's no denying that it was a miracle to get this game running so well on such limited hardware, but I just can't shake the feeling that Rare would have been better off creating new sprites that would have made this game a bit easier on the eyes, as opposed to dropping their assets bitrate to 0 and dragging the contrast up to dude, no! As is though, Donkey Kong Land kinda looks like somebody deep fried their copy of Donkey Kong Country. While you can make out what's going on fairly well in some of the levels, a good number of them just come across as a grayscale mess of pixels that can be pretty hard to find your place in. And that's while you're playing this on a device with a backlit screen like an emulator or a Game Boy Advance SP. As for playing this thing on the actual hardware it was released for, jeez. Without stating the obvious about how trying to play, well, nearly anything on the original Game Boy can be a bit rough, the biggest issue with playing Donkey Kong Land this way is how the good old DMG1's dark and ghosty screen impacts the visuals. Because, wow, if you thought that trying to process some of this game's busier screens on a more modern display was hard, trying to make sense of them on a Game Boy is outright impossible. During my playthrough, I just couldn't shake the feeling that there was way too much going on here to work on the Game Boy, and that while issues like flicker and slowdown were either few and far between or straight up non-existent, things never really came together for me visually due to the art style. Which is really weird because I'm actually obsessed with early CG art in the same style as Donkey Kong Country's. I think my main issue with it in this game is that the Game Boy just doesn't do the art style any compliments. Part of what makes that early CGI art look so great on the SNES is, aside from the obvious answer of a higher resolution, the highly saturated use of color alongside it. And that's just something that the original Game Boy can't really emulate, what with its ability to only render 4 shades of gray. Or puke green if you want to be specific. And while I can't really blame Rare for this due to it being a limitation placed on them by the hardware, and because I'm still convinced they were held at gunpoint when they made this thing, it's still the worst part of the game by far for me. And like I said earlier, the visuals are impressive from a technical standpoint. They just don't work for me in motion, and I would have preferred simpler visuals because of it. One area where Donkey Kong Land totally shines though is in its music. The game rearranges some tunes from its console counterpart to great effect, while also mixing in some new originals, and genuinely stands as the perfect complement to the 16-bit version that the rest of this game wanted to be. Listening to songs like Aquatic Ambience, DK Island Swing, or Gangplan Galleon in 8-bit form are a treat, and the game's originals are also really well done and complement the adventure. Something about these 8-bit demakes just sound right, and genuinely goes to show that stripping the high-quality samples and layered stereo sound of the SNES original to its bare bones could really work when done with care. While I don't see myself listening to the Game Boy versions of some of DKC's music over the originals, I really enjoyed listening to them while I played through the game. In fact, the quality of the soundtrack probably helped keep me engaged with the game for far longer than I would have been otherwise. Even though the Game Boy's sound capabilities are infamously, well, bad, Donkey Kong Land's soundtrack stands as one of my favorite ones on the console, in spite of its technical limitations. So does Donkey Kong Land hold up? No, not really. While I do think that the game is honestly pretty good, there's no denying that it's also fairly rough around the edges. And while it may have been easier to overlook some of these faults back in the 90s, these issues have been compounded somewhat by the ability to play the, frankly, superior Donkey Kong Country portably on stuff like the Nintendo Switch or any modern emulation handheld. Still, Donkey Kong Land is a fun game with serviceable level design, ambitious graphics, and a genuinely fantastic soundtrack. It's just that these qualities aren't enough to make it worth playing these days due to how held back the game feels thanks to the hardware it was released on. That said, if you're a fan of the Donkey Kong Country games and either haven't played through this one before or are just looking to mix things up while still getting in some classic rare platforming goodness, this game is readily available on the 3DS Virtual Console and is relatively cheap on the secondhand market. While I can't recommend this game, I do think there was still some fun to be had with it and did ultimately enjoy myself more than I didn't. If anything, I'd just love to see this game reach its full potential in the form of something like an SNES remake via Donkey Kong Country ROM hack or something, which may actually already exist for all I know. Feel free to leave a like on the video or subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed what you saw today, as well as to answer the question of the day down in the comments or just leave a recommendation or two of a game you'd love to see reviewed in a future video. On top of that, you can support the channel via donation via the Buy Me a Coffee link down in the description or pinned comment, and you can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram by searching for @NichePlays on those respective sites or by following the link in the description too. So yeah, bye.